Picture this. June 1429, an English ambush waits in absolute lethal silence. Suddenly a panicked stag crashes through the underbrush directly into their lines. Instead of maintaining discipline, the most feared soldiers in Europe react like excited hunters. They roar and cheer at the animal. That single, blindingly stupid shout instantly gives away their position to the pursuing French cavalry. In less than 30 minutes, over 2,000 elite veterans are butchered on an open field. This is a chilling masterclass in how raw animal instinct can shatter a military empire. How did one lost deer trigger the Joan of Arc Battle of Patay and completely break England's grip on France? Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. The English army is already suffocating under a full-blown panic. They are running. Sir John Fastolf and Lord John Talbot are desperately driving their exhausted men northward toward Paris. The Loire River fortresses have completely collapsed. There is no safe harbour left, no secure supply line, and absolutely no food. Jean de Wavrin, a Burgundian soldier riding alongside the English that very day, recorded the brutal reality of their retreat. He noted the men were starving, weighed down by useless loot, and terrified of the French vanguard hunting them down. Fastolf demands they keep moving. He knows his heavy infantry and archers cannot survive a cavalry charge without hours to prepare a proper defence. Talbot refuses to swallow his pride. Running from a teenage peasant girl in armour is a humiliation he simply cannot stomach. The English actually halt their retreat just to argue. "I will fight them," Talbot screams during their frantic roadside council, "even if I only have my own sword." That toxic arrogance is a death sentence. The French forces hunting them are no longer the cautious, defeated men of the last decade. Joan of Arc has unleashed a feral, reckless aggression within their ranks. The French vanguard is riding their horses to the point of physical collapse, closing the gap with every wasted minute the English spend arguing. The fleeing soldiers can literally hear the distant thunder of heavy hooves. Men who once terrorized the French countryside now stare into the dark tree line. The terrifying reality sets in. The predators are now the prey. For 14 agonizing years, the idea of French knights actively hunting an English army was completely absurd. The French did not hunt, they hid. If you study 100 Years' War history, you quickly realize that nations do not lose wars because they run out of weapons. They lose when they run out of nerve. The trauma of the Battle of Agincourt in 1415 had infected the entire French military establishment with a paralysing chronic disease. Today we might diagnose it as severe PTSD. Back then, it looked exactly like cowardice. At Agincourt, the thick autumn mud swallowed the French heavy cavalry whole. English arrows turned the absolute pride of the French nobility into screaming pincushions. Thousands of aristocrats died suffocating under the weight of their own horses or bleeding out in the dirt. That single afternoon did not just destroy a generation of men. It completely broke the psychological spine of the French military. This terror created a suffocating economic and political reality. The heir to the throne, Dauphin Charles VII, was functionally bankrupt. He remained trapped in the castle of Chinon, spending his days hiding from his own creditors rather than fighting the English. Armies cost massive amounts of gold. You cannot fund a military campaign without collecting taxes, and desperate peasants flatly refuse to pay taxes to lords who cower behind stone walls, while English raiding parties burn their farms to ash. The French elite adopted a pathetic doctrine of extreme caution. They locked their castle gates, watched English armies march freely across their lands, and did absolutely nothing. The thirst for an Agincourt revenge was buried under thick layers of humiliation. The contemporary chronicle, Journal d'un bourgeois de Paris, captured this miserable atmosphere perfectly. The author bitterly noted that whenever the two sides met, the French forces fled like sheep before the wolves. The paralysis was absolute. As military historian Kelly de Vries points out in his analysis of the era, the French commanders were suffering from a profound inferiority complex. They were entirely convinced that stepping onto an open battlefield against the English was an automatic death sentence. I find it absolutely insane to think about this dynamic. You have a kingdom filled with heavy armour, thousands of war horses and seasoned veterans, all completely frozen by phantom arrows from a battle fought over a decade ago. This is exactly why the English commanders retreating toward Patay are so furiously confused. The rules of the game have suddenly changed. A 17-year-old illiterate girl from Domremy has violently disrupted their reality. Joan of Arc did not bring secret weapons to the front line. She did not bring advanced tactical formations. She brought a psychological defibrillator to a stopped heart. She looked straight into the eyes of these terrified, scarred warlords and demanded absolute aggression. She shattered the Agincourt syndrome, forcing the French to remember that they were wolves too. To understand the sheer violence about to unfold at Patay, you have to look at the men riding at the very front of the French vanguard. These were not the cautious, politically obsessed aristocrats hiding back in Chinon. At the tip of the spear rode Etienne de Vignolles, better known as La Hire, alongside the famous bastard of Orléans, Jean de Dunois. La Hire and Jean de Dunois were essentially the attack dogs of the French military. La Hire in particular was a notoriously brutal veteran. He was a man who had spent his entire adult life watching his country burn while his superiors repeatedly ordered him to stand down. He was a creature of pure, unadulterated anger. I honestly cannot imagine the immense psychological toll of being a born fighter physically restrained by the cowardice of your own government for over a decade. Throughout the early stages of the Loire Campaign 1429, these veteran commanders had clashed bitterly with the royal court's defensive strategies. They desperately wanted to draw English blood. They simply needed someone with enough unassailable authority to take the leash off. This exposes the most deeply misunderstood aspect of Joan of Arc's military career. Pop culture often paints her as a saintly tactical genius, personally swinging a broadsword on the front lines. The reality is far more terrifying for the English. Joan did not need to teach these hardened killers how to wage war. Her singular, brilliant contribution was giving them divine permission to be absolutely ruthless. She bypassed the cowardly politicians and spoke directly to the primal fury of men like La Hire. As the English army fled from the collapsing fortresses along the river, traditional French military doctrine demanded extreme caution. Standard protocol meant letting the enemy retreat, securing the newly captured towns, and avoiding a pitched battle on open ground at all costs. The High Command naturally hesitated. The French nobles nervously asked the Maid what they should do about the retreating English forces led by Sir John Fastolf and Lord Talbot. Joan did not consult maps. She did not ask for a tactical risk assessment. She looked at her warlords and delivered a chillingly simple directive. "Have good spurs," she told them. When the confused nobles asked if she meant they would be forced to retreat and ride away from the English, she shook her head. "No," Joan firmly replied. "It is the English who will not defend themselves, and they will be beaten. You will need good spurs to chase them." With those few words, the chains finally snapped. La Hire and Dunois were entirely unburdened from 14 years of defensive anxiety. They completely ignored traditional marching orders. They did not even wait for their own infantry. They gathered the heaviest, fastest armoured cavalry they possessed and rode down the fleeing English with a terrifying, single-minded purpose. The hounds were finally off the leash, and they were sprinting straight toward the village of Patay. While La Hire and his heavy cavalry tore across the French countryside, the English command structure was actively tearing itself apart. The frantic retreat from the Loire Valley had devolved into a bitter, screaming match between the two highest-ranking officers on the field. On one side stood Sir John Fastolf, a seasoned pragmatist who understood the cold, hard mathematics of warfare. On the other stood Lord John Talbot, a man whose entire military reputation was built on brutal aggression and an absolute contempt for the enemy. Fastolf recognised the lethal reality of their situation. He saw his exhausted men, the completely depleted rations, and the undeniable terror creeping into the ranks. A retreating army is fundamentally vulnerable. Fastolf explicitly warned the War Council that their soldiers were demoralised by the recent collapse of their river fortresses. In his mind, the only logical move was a rapid, non-stop withdrawal to a secure stronghold near Paris. They needed to link up with reinforcements from the Duke of Bedford and let the sudden French momentum burn itself out. Crucially, Fastolf knew that his archers were practically defenceless if caught moving. They required significant time to prepare the ground and drive their defensive wooden stakes into the earth. Talbot found this tactical caution deeply offensive. To him, retreating meant voluntarily surrendering the psychological supremacy England had enjoyed for over a decade. You really have to understand the mind of an English warlord in 1429. They genuinely viewed the French nobility as inferior combatants. Running away from an army they had spent 14 years butchering was a permanent stain on Talbot's personal honour. Worse, they were running from a teenage peasant girl who claimed to hear voices. The contemporary chronicler Enguerrand de Monstrelet captured the intense friction of this disastrous war council. He recorded that Fastolf practically begged the commanders to abandon their looted baggage and save the men, arguing that the soldiers were full of fear. Talbot viciously shut him down. He flatly rejected any strategy that involved turning his back. He demanded they halt the retreat, form up their defensive lines, and crush the French once and for all. This is the fatal flaw of imperial arrogance. When you easily dominate an enemy for a generation, you completely lose the ability to recognise when the power dynamic changes. Talbot was strategizing against the timid, broken French army of the past. He was completely blind to the fact that the men hunting him right now were riding with a feral, suicidal fury. His wounded pride effectively signed the death warrants of over 2,000 veterans. By forcing the English column to stall and argue about their honour, Talbot handed La Hire the exact amount of time needed to close the gap. The English vanguard reluctantly slowed its pace, looking for a place to make a stand, entirely unaware that the hounds were already at their heels. The village of Patay offered exactly what Lord John Talbot was looking for. It sat right at a natural choke point. The old road north intersected with overgrown hedges and dense woods, essentially forcing any pursuing army to squeeze through a narrow corridor. For an English commander steeped in the traditions of their past victories, this geography looked like a gift from God. It was the perfect terrain to funnel arrogant enemy cavalry straight into a concentrated killing zone. Talbot immediately ordered the vanguard to halt and deploy. This specific moment exposes a brutal reality of medieval military logistics. An English defensive formation did not just magically snap into existence. It required intense, physically exhausting manual labour. Every single archer carried a thick, double-pointed wooden stake, usually about 6 feet long. To survive a massive cavalry charge, thousands of starving, exhausted men had to hammer these stakes into the hard, sun-baked June earth at an exact outward angle. They had to interlock them to create an impenetrable wooden palisade. Military historian Clifford Rogers emphasises that this defensive setup was their absolute lifeline. Without those wooden stakes firmly planted in the dirt, lightly armoured infantry would be crushed into paste by armoured warhorses. Completing this wooden fortress required at least 30 to 40 minutes of uninterrupted, back-breaking work. And the English truly believed they had all the time in the world. Their scouts confidently reported that the main French army was miles away. The English command assumed they were still dealing with the same overly cautious, terrified aristocrats they had easily butchered for a decade. The contemporary French chronicler Jean Chartier perfectly captured the dangerously relaxed atmosphere spreading through the English ranks. He noted that the soldiers casually began to make their hedges and stakes with a shocking lack of urgency. They were entirely oblivious to the fact that Joan of Arc had completely rewritten the rules of engagement. I always find this specific window of time incredibly tense to read about. You know the absolute disaster that is barreling toward them, but the men on the ground are completely clueless. The English soldiers were likely catching their breath, taking swigs of dirty water, complaining about their blisters, and casually pounding their heavy wooden stakes into the dirt. They finally felt secure. They were preparing for a slow, formal, highly choreographed medieval battle. That battle was never going to happen. Further up the road, the English advance scouts settled into the thick underbrush. Their only job was to watch the horizon and send back a runner whenever the French finally plodded into view. No one expected an immediate violent clash. The trap was set. The terrain was flawless. Talbot's wounded imperial pride was finally going to be vindicated. They just needed the French to walk blindly into the meat grinder. Let's put ourselves in the muddy boots of the French scouts. They are moving cautiously through the thick underbrush south of Patay. They know the English are close. Finding a static, hidden army in 15th century woodland without any aerial reconnaissance is an absolute nightmare. You could easily stumble straight into a prepared killing zone and be annihilated before drawing your sword. Then, the woods violently erupt. A massive stag bursts through the foliage. Seconds later, a deafening roar of hundreds of English voices echoes through the trees. The English soldiers, acting on pure, idiotic hunting instinct, have just screamed at a deer. The French scouts freeze. They do not need to guess anymore. They know the exact coordinates of Talbot's vanguard. A rider instantly whips his horse around and sprints back down the road to find the French commander, Loire. When the breathless scout delivers the news, Loire faces a terrifying tactical dilemma. Traditional military doctrine demands that he halt his vanguard immediately. He's supposed to wait for the main French army, led by Joan of Arc and the Duke of Alençon, to finally catch up. He needs to deploy his infantry, bring up his own missile troops, and organise a formal, structured assault. Loire is a hardened veteran of endless, humiliating defeats. He understands the lethal geometry of the English longbow better than anyone. If he waits for his infantry, he hands Lord Talbot the precious 30 minutes needed to hammer those wooden stakes into the ground. Once those stakes are firmly planted, the English position becomes an impenetrable fortress. The French cavalry would simply bleed to death against a wall of sharpened timber, repeating the exact same nightmare of Agincourt. He makes a decision that permanently alters European history. Loire chooses pure, reckless aggression. He completely abandons the safety of standard military doctrine. He looks at his heavy cavalry and orders an immediate, uncoordinated frontal assault. According to the chronicles, his command was brutally simple. He roared at his knights, "Strike them boldly! In God's name, they are ours!" This is the exact moment the agonizing psychological trauma of the French military officially dies. For 14 long years, aristocratic commanders had endlessly debated, hesitated, and ultimately retreated. Loire does not hesitate for a single second. He does not ask the king for permission. He draws his weapon, digs his spurs into the flanks of his warhorse, and leads roughly 1,500 heavily armoured knights into a dead sprint. I find the raw physics of this moment absolutely terrifying. Imagine the sound of 1,500 massive warhorses accelerating from a trot to a full, uncontrolled gallop. The ground literally shakes. The sheer kinetic energy generated by thousands of tons of muscle, steel and bone tearing across the open countryside is incomprehensible. Loire is betting his life and the entire fate of the French nation on a single, desperate gamble. He must cross the open distance and smash into the English lines before a starving archer can swing a wooden mallet. The physical reality of a medieval cavalry charge is incredibly difficult for modern minds to grasp. Hollywood loves to show elegant choreographed sword fights where combatants gracefully parry and dodge. The reality on the field of Patay was blunt force trauma on an industrial scale. When Loire's knights suddenly crested the ridge, the English archers were still holding their unplanted wooden stakes. The shock was absolute. They did not even have the necessary seconds to string their bows properly, let alone form a defensive wall. You have to look at the terrifying mathematics of this collision. A fully armoured French knight riding a massive warhorse weighs close to 2,000 pounds. Now multiply that by 1,500, accelerating down a slight incline at 25 miles per hour. They slammed into the lightly armoured English infantry like a moving wall of solid iron. Without those sharpened wooden stakes driven deep into the earth to break the momentum, human bone simply snapped under the iron-shod hooves. There was no battle line, there was no heroic last stand. It was an immediate chaotic slaughter. Jean de Wavrin, the Burgundian chronicler riding alongside the English that day, watched the disaster unfold with his own eyes. He documented the utter collapse of discipline, writing that the English were so utterly taken by surprise that they could not put themselves in any order, and those who could flee did so. The famous English longbowmen, the very same class of soldiers who had systematically slaughtered the French aristocracy at Agincourt, were simply trampled into the dirt. The French heavy cavalry charge did not stop after the initial impact. They rode straight through the fragmented vanguard. The pent-up venomous rage of 14 years was finally unleashed on the open field. French knights used their heavy wooden lances until they completely splintered against English bodies. Then they drew maces, or hammers, and broadswords, ruthlessly riding down anyone trying to crawl into the surrounding bushes. The massacre was so incredibly one-sided that the French commanders did not even bother to halt and reform their ranks. They just kept hunting. The speed and sheer violence of the assault completely severed the English vanguard from the rest of their retreating army. Lord John Talbot, the fiercely arrogant commander who demanded they stop and fight, found himself entirely swallowed by the chaos of his own screaming men. The invincible aura of the English military was bleeding out in the grass, crushed under the weight of an enemy they had fundamentally underestimated. The sheer velocity of the French assault shattered the English vanguard before the main army even realised a battle had started. Let's look closely at the total collapse of the English command structure during this chaos. Sir John Fastolf was riding with the main body of the retreating army just a short distance behind Talbot's position. When panicked survivors from the vanguard smashed into his lines, screaming about thousands of French knights, Fastolf faced a brutal decision. He could order his exhausted infantry to rush forward into the meat grinder to save Talbot, or he could cut his losses and run. Fastolf chose survival. He looked at the absolute disaster unfolding ahead, realised the vanguard was already dead, and ordered his men to turn around and flee toward Paris. To the English public back home, this was an act of unforgivable treason. Fastolf was later temporarily stripped of his prestigious Order of the Garter and heavily branded a coward. But militarily speaking, he was the only English commander that day who actually understood the harsh economics of warfare. Throwing lightly armed infantry into a swirling melee of heavy cavalry without a prepared defensive line is just an expensive suicide. Meanwhile, Lord John Talbot, the man who arrogantly refused to retreat, paid the ultimate price for his pride. He did not get a glorious, heroic last stand like a knight in an Arthurian legend. The historical reality was humiliating. As his defensive formation instantly disintegrated, Talbot was swallowed by the panicked stampede of his own soldiers. His horse was struck down in the confusion, violently pinning him to the earth. As he lay trapped and helpless in the dirt, the terrifying French vanguard swept right over his position. The great English lion was dragged from the mud and taken prisoner by the very people he had spent his entire life mocking. This is the exact moment the ghost of Agincourt is finally exorcised. The French soldiers riding down the fleeing English archers were not looking to capture men for ransom. They were extracting a blood debt. For a decade and a half, these specific longbowmen had terrorised the French countryside, acting with complete, untouchable impunity. Now, without their wooden stakes and their organised ranks, they were just exhausted, terrified men running through the underbrush. The French knights hunted them relentlessly into the late afternoon. By the time the sun finally set over the Loire Valley, the fields around Patay were littered with the bodies of over 2,000 English veterans. The invincible military machine had been completely dismantled. Walking across the battlefield of Patay the next morning would have been a profoundly surreal experience for the French. They were not just looking at a pile of enemy casualties, they were looking at the ruins of a generational biological weapon. To truly grasp the magnitude of this English disaster, you have to completely separate the medieval longbowman from a regular soldier. You can forge a steel broadsword in a few days, you can construct a reliable suit of armour in a few weeks. Replacing an English archer required at least a decade of agonising physical conditioning. The English crown relied on strict national mandates requiring boys to practice archery every single Sunday from the age of 7. Drawing a war bow with a pull weight of up to 150 pounds physically altered a human skeleton. It thickened the bones in the left arm and literally twisted the spine. You cannot simply conscript a random farmer, hand him a heavy yew-bow, and expect him to pierce plate armour at 300 yards. He physically cannot pull the string back. This is pure military economics. England did not have an unlimited population. By losing over 2,000 elite archers in a single afternoon, the English army suffered a catastrophic deficit of human capital. They lost an entire specialised workforce that had taken over 10 years to cultivate. As military historian Robert Hardy summarised the severity of this blow, the men slaughtered at Patay represented an investment of time and training that no amount of gold could rapidly replace. The French had effectively bankrupted the English war machine. Beyond the staggering loss of highly trained specialists, England lost something far more valuable. They lost the psychological supremacy they had held over the continent since Agincourt. The aura of invincibility is a fragile thing. Once an oppressed people realise their terrifying masters can bleed, the fear evaporates entirely. The French knights riding around the blood-soaked fields of Patay suddenly realised the English were just men. They were men who screamed, panicked and died when hit with a mace. The Agincourt syndrome was officially dead. The paralysing terror that had kept the French locked inside their castles for 14 years vanished overnight. A massive wave of aggressive momentum swung wildly in favour of the French crown. English garrisons stationed in nearby towns heard the gruesome details of the slaughter and began abandoning their posts without a fight. The hunters had been brutally exterminated, and the entire landscape of the 100 Years' War shifted irreversibly. Everything the English had built over a decade of bloodshed was unravelling in a matter of days. With the English military machine completely shattered at Patay, the geographic and psychological road to Rheims was thrown wide open. There was no longer a veteran army standing between the Dauphin Charles and his sacred crown. Lord John Talbot was sitting in a French prison, and the terrified survivors of the English vanguard were scattered to the wind. French towns and heavy fortresses that had sworn fierce loyalty to the English crown just weeks earlier now peacefully opened their gates as the French army marched past. The local lords could clearly see the terrifying shift in momentum. Just 1 month after the slaughter in the Loire Valley, Charles VII was officially crowned King of France in the massive cathedral of Rheims. Joan of Arc stood directly by his side, proudly holding her battle standard. This singular victory fundamentally altered 100 Years' War history. The conflict instantly transitioned from a slow, agonising French defeat into a war of aggressive national liberation. The English government would desperately try to rebuild their shattered longbow units, but they would never again field an army with the same overwhelming, arrogant confidence they carried before Patay. If you study this specific era, you have to appreciate the profound irony of how empires actually fall. The English elite spent 14 years constructing an empire built on the unstoppable physics of the yew-bow and the psychological terror of Agincourt. They genuinely believed their military supremacy was a permanent law of nature. Yet, that entire imperial structure was dismantled in a single afternoon. It did not take a brilliant, highly educated tactical genius to defeat them. It took a 17-year-old illiterate girl who gave her commanders permission to be violently ruthless, and a terrified deer running through the wrong patch of woods. It is a stark historical reminder that the line between absolute power and total collapse is incredibly thin. You can spend decades perfecting the ultimate military machine, only to watch it burn to the ground because of a single, unpredictable variable. If you found this breakdown insightful, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us continue uncovering these brutal, forgotten turning points in history. Let me know in the comments below if you want us to cover the tragic, fiery conclusion to Joan's life in Rouen, or if we should explore another medieval battlefield. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video.